before clocks ticked and blankets were invented, before blackout curtains or the sweet tyranny of snooze buttons. Humans slept a little differently. In fact, for nearly all of human history, we didn't sleep through the night at all. We slept in bursts, gently, as if the moon had politely asked us to take a break from consciousness. Let's drift back thousands of years to a time when the night was more mystery than nuisance, when the stars weren't just pinholes in the sky, but reassuring old friends who knew your grandmother's name. Back then, bedtime wasn't an appointment. It was an ebb and flow, like tides on the shores of human habit. Early humans, wandering through a surprisingly gossipy savannah, did not curl up at 10 p.m. sharp after binge-watching cave-wall Netflix. No, they followed the rhythms of firelight and leopard paranoia. This wasn't a consistent 8 hours. It was polyphasic sleep, a fancy phrase for lots of little naps whenever the universe stopped trying to kill you. By medieval times, in quieter corners of Europe, sleep had become a two-part affair. Historical records lovingly refer to this as first sleep and, prepare to be blown away, second sleep. Around sunset, people would nod off for a few hours. Then, like well-rested raccoons, they'd wake up, pad around groggily in their shift gowns, and do the human equivalent of checking their phones. What did medieval folks do at 1 in the morning, you ask? Oh, you know, they prayed, had entire philosophical conversations, lit a candle and read about saints, made babies, fixed their socks. It was peak productivity, at peak darkness. By 1600, there are dozens of diaries and letters mentioning these wakeful windows. People waking from first sleep around midnight and staying up for an hour or two, then drifting peacefully into second sleep until dawn's slightly judgmental light arrived. Even curiously named sleep doctor Roger E. Kirch, well, doctor of history, but that still counts, uncovered this lovely little secret. In his research, he found more than 500 references to this biphasic sleep in historical texts. It wasn't just a quirky local custom, it was global. Ancient Greek philosophers mentioned it. So did Dickens. And the Canterbury Tales casually drops it in, like Sleep was a two-part musical. But why don't we do this anymore? Well, let's gently blame the light bulb, and maybe capitalism. By the 19th century, gaslighting and then electric bulbs began to stretch the daytime into unnatural shapes. Suddenly, shops stayed open longer. Work hours got longer. People began to expect sleep to be efficient, like treating your dreams as a board meeting you couldn't reschedule. Add in Industrial Revolution logic, where productivity was practically a fifth element, and before long, segmented sleep was seen as inefficient, or at the very least, vaguely suspicious. After all, what honest citizen wakes up at 2 a.m. to make stew and recite psalms? But of course, our biology hasn't fully caught up. Many people today still wake in the middle of the night, stare at the ceiling, and worry they're broken, when in fact, they may be ancient souls, unwittingly keeping medieval hours. It turns out, the error isn't in the sleeper, but in the clock. Even modern sleep researchers admit there's nothing inherently wrong with waking in the middle of the night. You might say your body simply craves a bit of that old-timey midnight intermission. A quiet pause to sip water, pet the cat, or imagine yourself in a candlelit habit discussing theology with a wandering monk named Gregor. So if you find yourself waking at 3:12 a.m. for seemingly no reason, don't panic. You're just training with the monks. Sleep has always been part dance, part compromise. A little dictated by weather, candles, hungry roosters. And today, a little bossed around by blue light and the false parenting of our phones. Still, if you close your eyes and listen carefully, you just might hear the echo of a wooden house whisper. First sleep done. Let's sit by the fire and talk nonsense. This, dear listener, was how we began to know sleep. Not as a long blackout, but a series of gentle descents, interrupted only by dreams, firewood, and someone needing to pee. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now curl into the hush of your pillow. The past isn't done with us yet, and there are still stars to meet. It's difficult to imagine now. In a world where the glow of a billion tiny screens outshines the stars. But sleep used to come with the sunset, like a dinner guest who never asked to stay over, but always brought the gift of unconsciousness. Long ago, before electricity, caffeine or TikTok dances under LED strip lights, humans lived and slept by the light of the sun. In small bands of hunter-gatherers, they would trudge through forests or stalk the savannah by day and return to their shelters, their caves, or their conspicuously leafed stick huts by twilight. With the fire crackling and the wolves hopefully staying politely outside the firelight, our ancestors would curl up and drift into a type of sleep that modern insomnia sufferers might regard with reverence and envy. But what might surprise you is that for a large part of human history, people didn't sleep all the way through the night. They had two sleeps. Yes, two. The first sleep began shortly after nightfall, as soon as it was decently dark and you finished digesting whatever roots, tubers, or recently roasted wildebeest had been on the menu. This sleep would last a few hours, gently carrying folks into the deepest stages of slumber, dream-drenched and drool-heavy. Then, round about midnight or so, something curious would happen. They would wake up, not in a panic, not in terror, but calmly and consciously, as if on a biological intermission. This period of wakefulness, often lasting an hour or more, was a time for reflection, quiet conversation, maybe a bowl of onion soup. We'll come back to that. Or, in some cases, well, marital diplomacy. During this interval, people spoke to neighbors, whispered to family, and yes, even prayed. The hour was considered special, almost sacred. Monks took advantage of this period for midnight devotions, as if they had struck a secret deal with the circadian rhythm gods. Some people even kept note of their dreams during this break, an ancient form of journaling practiced by soft candlelight and harder pillows. Then, sometime before the first rooster began his unsolicited alarm clock duties, humans would drift back into what was called second sleep. This phase carried people gently through the early morning hours until dawn peeked over the horizon like a nosy neighbor with a flashlight. You may be wondering, why two sleeps? And more importantly, why did we ever stop? Well, the two-sleep pattern likely emerged naturally from our environment. Before the invention of artificial lighting, darkness reigned supreme, and it lasted a long time. Depending on the season, night stretched on for up to 14 hours in the winter months. That's a lot of time to lie still if you're not a hibernating bear. So instead, humans adapted by slipping into two reasonably sized chunks of sleep, bridged by a little midnight meandering of the mind. Things began to change in the 17th century, when cities grew bright with lanterns and later, the mischief of gas lamps. We brightened our evenings, extended our social lives, invented prime time before the term even existed. First in London and Paris, and then across other major cities, this cultural shift nudged bedtime further and further forward, until eventually, like forgotten laundry, The first sleep just never came back. By the time Thomas Edison lit up the 20th century with his bulbs and his bustle, consolidated sleep had become the new norm. In modern industrialized societies, 8 straight hours became both a rule and a dream, more often one than the other. The idea of waking up at midnight to write poetry, chat with neighbors, or eat soup now sounds like the sort of thing only deeply irregular poets do. Ah yes, the onion soup. In several historical accounts, people report eating small warm meals during their wakeful midnight hours. A bowl of broth, perhaps with a crust of bread. Likely not the most glamorous meal, but certainly comforting. There's something deeply human about it. To rouse from dreams, share a few quiet words, slurp a sip of soup, then return to sleep, belly warm and mind calmed. As strange as it seems to our modern sensibilities, history hints that segmented sleep may be the most natural rhythm of human rest. One that we forgot somewhere along the road, between candlelight and Blu-ray. So tonight, if you wake briefly at 2 a.m. and lie there staring at the ceiling, perhaps you're not suffering from insomnia. Perhaps you're just remembering a way of being that hasn't quite left us. A lull in the night that was once expected, even cherished. One that gave space between 2 sleeps for dreams to stretch out their legs and wander. Softly now, let's leave our midnight soup behind and follow the firelight backward, back to the shelters of those earlier sleepers and the bedtime habits we inherited long before alarm clocks ever rang. Let's drift back, farther than electric lights, farther than street lamps flickering under moth moons, into a time when the stars had the final say on when you should be in bed. We find ourselves now curled in the firelit glow of a Neolithic dwelling. Outside, jackals mutter philosophical quandaries to the moon, and inside, a shaggy family is preparing for what anthropologists reluctantly call segmented sleep. That's right, humans didn't always conk out for 8 jam-packed hours like a well-oiled office intern. Before the invention of the modern to-do list and its cruel cousin, the alarm clock, we had a rather flexible relationship with sleep. Back then, people generally went to bed not long after the sun said goodnight, because let's face it, when your only light source is fire and your entertainment options are stare at the wall or gently argue about rocks, sleep becomes very appealing. But here's the dreamy twist. Early sleepers didn't spend the entire night in a single block of horizontal commitment. Instead, they slept in 2 distinct phases. The first sleep usually began a couple of hours after sundown and lasted until just after midnight. Then, poof, a natural interlude opened its arms. This wasn't a horrifying toss-and-turn insomnia episode as one might fear, but rather a calm, wakeful pocket of time. People would quietly rise, tend the fire, sip something warm if they could, or chat with someone else indulging in this sleepy halftime. Some might jot down dreams with charcoal on the wall, though unfortunately for historians, no one invented charcoal-proof dream diaries, and so we may never know how many featured flying goats and inexplicably angry squirrels. Religious folk might get up to pray. Lovers might, discuss philosophy. It's been said that this interlude, this in-between space of darkness and thought, was often the most creatively rich and reflective part of the night. And just when the stars began their slow descent and the night felt old enough to yawn, people returned to their beds, such as they were, and set off on their second sleep, a term that sounds wonderfully medieval and mildly hobbit-like. This dual sleep cycle was so common, it even shows up in old literature. In England, way back before the glow of Tesco signs, folks spoke regularly of first sleep and second sleep. It wasn't odd or inconvenient. It was just what people did. Imagine, for just a moment, how magical that must have felt. Waking gently in the middle of the night, not to the blare of a phone or the panic of missed emails, but to stillness, crackling fire, and a soft moment of reflection. Maybe a stretch, maybe some chess if you're feeling fancy, or just sitting, thinking, being. All right, perhaps less chess and more quietly whittling a stick into another slightly smaller stick. But really, who's to say which is more meditative? This segmented sleep continued to reign supreme for centuries. It wasn't until the 17th century, as candles grew cheaper and caffeine slinked its way into more mugs, that people started nudging bedtime later and later. Cities lit up, work schedules stretched, and suddenly, a single block of sleep, an uninterrupted stretch from nightfall to morning, became the new goal. The old rhythm was slowly smoothed over, tucked into the folds of forgotten history, like a once favorite lullaby, humming quietly in the archives. It's worth noting that in countries with siesta traditions, those wonderful midday nap zones, the sleep schedule stayed flexible in its own way. But the double sleep pattern, as charmingly analog as it was, started to fade in the face of all that bright, blazing artificial light. And coffee, so much coffee. In modern sleep studies, researchers have even observed that if you remove artificial light altogether, lock people in a darkened room for long enough, with their consent of course, they tend to revert naturally back to the first sleep, second sleep pattern. It's as if some ancient metronome inside us remembers the rhythm of restfulness beyond Netflix and deadlines. So tonight, if you find yourself waking up at 2 a.m. and lying there with your eyes open while the clock glows like an accusing moon, try not to worry. You may just be brushing against something very ancient, something very normal. You might just be echoing a rhythm humanity once knew intimately, when dreams came in 2 acts and the long, dark night was never something to be fought, but something gently folded in between. And speaking of bright ideas that change the way we sleep, as dawn begins to whisper, we'll quietly tiptoe toward the invention that quite literally flipped the switch on all this. As far back as ancient Mesopotamia, which is a fancy historical way of saying a really long time ago between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, people were already trying to figure out how to sleep like proper adults. Though they didn't yet have blackout curtains, weighted blankets, or even the luxury of silence, they somehow managed to get by. Mostly. The Sumerians, one of the earliest civilizations, believed that sleep was a temporary sort of death. So naturally, they built their beds more like altars, and less like the plushy havens we know today. See, they imagined that while your body slept, your soul went off on a kind of spirit tourism, a sabbatical if you will, and waking up was like your soul clocking back into its earthly timesheet. Of course, this view slightly complicated their bedtime routine. Imagine brushing your teeth while thinking, right, better make sure my soul knows how to get back. Their neighbors, the Babylonians, also got rather metaphysical about snoozing. They believed dreams were messages from the gods, probably because some of their dreams were bizarre enough to need divine explanation. Floating hippos wearing hats. Must be Marduk trying to tell me something. Nonetheless, tucked away in homes made of mud brick with reed mats for bedding, these ancient sleepers operated on a different rhythm than ours. Life was tied to the rise and fall of the sun, and without Netflix or street lamps, darkness more or less insisted you sleep. But here's the thing. Most people back then didn't sleep in one. continuous stretch. Instead, they had segmented sleep, 2 distinct chunks of slumber with a soft intermission in between. After the first sleep, you might wake for an hour or 2 to stoke the fire, chat with your family, perhaps whisper a little nighttime gossip like, "Did you see Enlil trip over that goat today?" Very scandalous. Some people even chose this time for quiet reflection, or, less romantically, to check that the roof wasn't leaking. Then would come the second sleep, drifting once more into unconsciousness before morning arrived like a nosy neighbor. This biphasic sleep pattern lingered for centuries. Even the Romans, who invented aqueducts, concrete, and some of history's weirdest statues, generally expected to have a midnight pause. The philosopher Pliny the Elder recommended waking up at night to do some deep thinking, which, let's be honest, sounds exhausting. Who meditates at 2:30 a.m. unless their cat knocked over a vase? Nighttime was also a peculiar melange of fear and wonder for early civilizations. Without artificial lighting, the dark was full of mystery, both celestial and rodential. Yes, it was beautiful to gaze upon a sky unpolluted with smog, packed with all the stars you forgot existed, but it was also mildly terrifying, especially when something rustled in the corner and torches were no match for a sneaky rat army. Because lighting a candle meant burning something, and burning something meant using up precious fuel. Nighttime inventions were often incredibly practical. People learned to live with the dark in ways we've forgotten. Eyes adjusted, footsteps softened, and dreams became more vivid. It was during these hours of flickering silence that stories were told, myths passed down, and constellations named after things like scorpions and very dramatic bears. The Greeks, poetic as ever, had their own take on sleep. They personified it as Hypnos, the winged god of rest, whose brother was Thanatos, the personification of death. Yep. According to Greek mythology, sleep and death were siblings, which, to be honest, kind of tracks if you've ever hit snooze 27 times and considered simply outsourcing existence. In fact, the Greek belief in nightly visitations turned sleep into something magical. A nightly encounter with dreams was a portal to signs, symbols, and the occasional unconvincing prophecy. Some temples even doubled as sleep sanctuaries, where people would go to sleep under divine supervision in hopes of healing dreams. And yes, they believed dreams could cure foot warts and indigestion. Imagine calling your insurance and saying, "I'll need a referral to a dream oracle, please." So while we're here now fiddling with white noise apps and questioning our life choices at 3 a.m., it's comforting to remember that our ancestors were just as confused by sleep. They respected it, ritualized it, occasionally feared it, but always surrendered to it. Because, whether in mud huts or marble villas, when the sky darkens and eyelids grow heavy, humans have always been whispering the same silent agreement. We'll figure it out tomorrow. Let us drift now, gently, deeper into this velvety timeline of sleep, where candles burn low and ancient lullabies echo beyond the firelight. There's much more moonlit mischief ahead, as the moonlight spilled softly over the rooftops of ancient Rome, casting shadows on cobblestone streets and toga-clad insomniacs. Something rather peculiar was happening behind closed villa doors. Wealthy Romans were putting considerable effort into not sleeping too much. In a culture best known for gladiators, aqueducts, and public baths, where small talk got alarmingly unfiltered, sleep was often treated with a kind of aristocratic suspicion. You see, in elite Roman society, leisure was good, but oversleeping? That hinted at laziness, or worse, a loss of control. And Romans prized control almost as much as they did garum, their famously fishy fermented condiment. Take Marcus Tullius Cicero, for instance, statesman, philosopher, and full-time judger of sleep habits. He once scolded someone for rising at the scandalous hour of dawn, claiming it showed a lack of discipline. In Cicero's view, any man worth his sandals should be up before the sun just to give the day a good Roman glare. The upper crust would often get up in the middle of the night to ponder Stoic philosophy, write letters, look broodingly out their domus windows, or pace dramatically in their sandals before winding down again. It wasn't insomnia, it was a lifestyle brand. Of course, this midnight productivity freed up time during the day for naps. Yes, while they disapproved of excessive nighttime sleep, Romans embraced the meridiatio, a siesta-style midday snooze. Around the 6th hour, which in ancient Roman timekeeping came out to roughly noon, shopkeepers would close, markets fell quiet, and even the Senate might pause its endless debates. For about 2 hours, entire Roman cities seemed dipped in honeyed stillness as citizens dozed, reclined, and possibly dreamed of better lead plumbing. Roman bedrooms, or cubiculum, were humble almost to the point of Spartan. No queen-size feather beds or dozen pillows here. A mattress stuffed with straw or wool, a single blanket, and maybe some frescoes of mythological creatures who looked just judgmental enough to keep you from lingering too long in bed. But let us not overstate their stoicism. Oh no. Wealthy Romans had bed slaves, or cubiculari, who were expected to warm the bed if needed, or summon a physician if your dreams got too dramatic. Nothing quite like drifting off with a servant standing by, in case you sneeze in your sleep. Lighting also played an intriguing role. Without electricity, and before the tick-tock scroll of doom, the Roman evening dimmed gracefully. Oil lamps flickered with sesame seed flames, casting long shadows of laurel, crowns and tunics. The world wound down with no backlit screens, and circadian rhythms sighed with relief. At night, in the poorer insulae, multi-story Roman apartment blocks that were definitely not up to fire code, residents might huddle together for warmth. The walls were thin, which added a charming auditory component to bedtime. One could be sung to sleep by a neighbour's snoring, or lulled by muffled arguments about cabbage prices echoing through brittle sand bricks. And what about dreams? Romans took theirs seriously. Dreams were seen as prophetic, divine dispatches wrapped in metaphor and slightly off-putting animal symbolism. Emperors even employed official dream interpreters, fancy sleep whisperers who could divine political advice from someone's vision about flying turnips and speechless consuls. One such interpreter famously warned Caligula to avoid water after the emperor dreamed of being a fish. Caligula ignored this, went swimming, and contracted a particularly unpleasant fever. Thus began a long tradition of blaming dreams for bad policy, now practiced in board meetings and half-sincere horoscopes the world over. Still, in spite of their solemnity and status consciousness, Romans knew the value of rest. They may have risen early to plot the expansion of empire, but they also carved hours from their day for stillness, warmth, and the small intimacy of shared snoring. To be Roman was to balance ambition with a bit of bathhouse tranquility, even if you carried that ambition into your slumber. Even the mighty Julius Caesar, famed for his battlefield naps and uncanny ability to sleep through anything except betrayal, once claimed he could rest anywhere, at any time. One wonders if, on the eve of the Ides of March, he dozed off without a care in the world, purring like a content lion. unaware that his friends were practicing a different kind of sleep strategy entirely. And so, beneath the arches of a fading empire, with lamp oil waning and sandals quietly resting by the door, Romans drifted into their intermittent slumber, dreams swirling with gods, politics, and perhaps just a dash of fermented fish sauce. Let's float onward now, past marble columns and whispering mosaics, into the twinkling embers of another ancient night. They say warfare never sleeps, but that's a bit rich coming from people who've clearly never tried to march for 14 hours on half a potato and a hardened biscuit, with the texture of regret. But real historians know, armies may fight in the daylight, but it's in the night hours, those precious moments between skirmishes, that humanity's restless relationship with sleep wrote some of its strangest chapters. This brings us to an oddly specific and charming lullaby from the past. The military nap. Yes, sleep on the battlefield wasn't just a necessity. It was a logistical puzzle, a performance art, and in many ways, an early version of the coffee break, but with fewer mugs and considerably more mud. Back before precision alarm clocks and noise-cancelling goose-down pillows, soldiers relied on versions of segmented sleep. Entire battle plans were, at times, built around the idea that sleep came in stolen portions, like ancient vending machine snacks, dispensed in 2-hour naps stuck between the roar of cannons and the occasional enemy trumpet solo. In Roman times, legionaries operated in shifts, a form of polyphasic sleep, not unlike that of a night shift intern trying to pass a Latin exam. Soldiers took turns keeping watch, a system called vigiliae, which divided the night into quarters. Each quarter, or watch, lasted around 3 hours, meaning that every soldier both guarded and slumbered. In theory. In practice, it involved a lot more dozing, standing up and muttering Latin oaths that don't translate well for polite company. Centuries later, in the awkward pajama-free haze of medieval Europe, castle guards slept while leaning on hooks installed into tower walls. That's right, hooks. These little architectural wonders were designed to catch a belt loop or a tunic hem, just enough to keep a drowsy watchman from falling headfirst into the moat. Safety first, slumber second. And then, of course, we arrive at the Napoleonic Wars, a surprisingly underexplored moment in the history of battlefield snoring. Napoleon Bonaparte, who famously claimed he only slept 4 hours a night, had a reputation for napping at the most bafflingly inconvenient times. While his generals panicked over strategy, Bonaparte might sit under a tree, pull his hat gently over his face like a flustered librarian, and take a 20-minute power nap with frightening confidence. According to eyewitnesses, he possessed the unnerving ability to fall asleep within moments, anywhere, battlefields, tents, or even horseback. Modern science would diagnose him with enviable sleep hygiene. We might also diagnose him with some truly questionable taste in war, decor, but that's another story. But the soldiers under his command, poor souls, they weren't gifted with his supernatural sleep switch. French infantrymen developed a tradition of curling together on the ground like baguette-shaped cats, wrapped in rough wool coats, each dreaming, presumably, of a warm fire, a high pile of cheese, and a day without cannonballs. During long marches, soldiers were trained to nap while on the move, in a sort of standing sleep shuffle. Diaries described the phenomenon, men snoring softly as their legs somehow continued their weary rhythm, following the boots of the fellow in front. It wasn't conscious so much as momentum in action. They were human metronomes ticking toward the next stop. Meanwhile, across the channel, British redcoats practiced something called bivouac rest, This involved lying down on damp ground in freezing cold, with nothing more than a blanket and shared body heat to stiffen the upper lip. The term good night sleep was, it seems, not native to the field. And yet, there was an odd intimacy to it all. Shared sleep on the battlefield created bonds, not just of necessity, but of nightly survival. Men rotated watch duties, kept each other warm, and developed the uncanny talent of falling into deep, snore-peppered sleep within breathy seconds, despite the threat of a cavalry charge. War, despite all its clamour, taught us patience with our bodies' quirks. And in stolen moments between volleys, humanity proved once again that it will find a way to nap, even if it involves wooden shoes, puddles, or the thunder of 1,000 boots. As night draped itself over ancient camps and flickering watchfires danced against grim clouds, it wasn't always the victors who slept soundly, but sleep, curiously and stubbornly, came all the same. Now, if you're feeling drowsy yourself, perhaps not from marching through France, but from the gentle pull of clean sheets and sleepy musings, then you're in good company. As we drift toward our next sleepy chapter, let's tiptoe softly into another peculiarity of the human sleep saga, the tale of the segmented night. As candlelight flickered across the mossy walls of medieval cottages, a curious custom was taking place behind warped wooden shutters and draughty lattice windows. Peasants, nobles, and monks alike were indulging in one of history's sleepiest secrets, the two-part slumber. Yes, long before we invented blue light screens and the 9-to-5 hustle, humans were quite comfortable breaking the night into two cozy halves. Imagine you're a farmer in 13th century England. You've spent your daylight hours hacking at frozen turnips, praying to various saints for your aching back, and dodging yet another overconfident goose from your landlord's estate. As dusk settles, you share a hearty meal, stew of indeterminate contents, with your family. Wrap yourself in coarse wool blankets and drift off into what was known as first sleep. This first sleep would last from early evening until around midnight. Then, poof, an intermission. A quiet, dreamlike window of wakefulness that lasted an hour or more, in which the whole village sort of, vibed. People during this liminal stretch might stoke the fire, chat in hushed tones, or even step outside to stargaze, assuming it wasn't the sort of weather that gave your mustache frostbite. Some read from prayer books, whispered confessions, or engaged in what historical records delicately call other marital recreations, all under the sleepy blessing of candlelight and crickets. It wasn't insomnia, it was intentional. Then came second sleep, which carried people from these midnight musings through to dawn. One 17th century French physician referred to this waking break as the watch, and it was entirely unremarkable to him, just part of the human rhythm, like sneezing or passive-aggressively curing meat. In literature, too, we find traces. Chaucer's characters remark on rising from first to sleep, while the historian Roger Ekirch later combed through centuries' worth of diaries and court records, stitching together this broken bedtime into a coherent tapestry of human history. So what changed? Why do we now aim for one long stretch of sleep as if we're contestants in an Olympic slumber marathon? Well, the answer, conveniently, has to do with candles, clocks, and caffeine. As urban life expanded in the 18th and 19th centuries, people moved into cities where artificial lighting extended productive hours beyond sundown. And if you could now work or socialize after dark, why waste time lingering in a twilight intermission between snoozes? Not to mention, The Industrial Revolution came along overconfidently, plunking down factory whistles and timetables where dreams and dusk once ruled. When your job starts at 6 a.m. sharp and your boss doesn't consider between sleeps a valid excuse, single sleep cycles suddenly seem more appealing. And so, bimodal sleep was quietly ushered behind the curtain. People began to forget it had ever existed. Doctors now started labeling wakefulness in the middle of the night as insomnia, rather than what it possibly was: your body wistfully remembering a medieval tradition where dreams came in 2 acts. Of course, some modern sleep scientists whisper that perhaps we've lost something in this change, that our natural biorhythms might still hum to the tune of that ancient interlude. Ever woken up around 3 a.m., inexplicably alert? Might not be stress or screens, might be echoes of your great and then some grandfather waking up in his thatched hut to sip weak ale by firelight and make conversation with the cat. Just imagine it, a world where waking in the wee hours is not a problem, but a tiny, serene reprieve. Time to reflect, write in a journal made of bark, or marvel that the stars still exist, even with all our modern nonsense. Sometimes, in learning how we used to sleep, we discover what rest really means. And as night deepens, let us ever so gently drift past the soot and slippers of early modern nights and into the golden bedsheets of one of humanity's sleepiest innovations, the invention of the bedroom itself. Somewhere between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of coffee-fueled Enlightenment philosophers losing sleep over metaphysics, the medieval world quietly drifted into one of the most peculiar sleep patterns in human history: the segmented night. Imagine it. The year is 1320. The average peasant, named something like Eldwine or Merwin, is snoring blissfully beneath a thatched roof, cocooned in layers of wool and itchy linen, with the comforting scent of livestock wafting in from the adjoining stable space. But a few hours after dusk, Merwin stirs. Not just her. Nearly the entire village is shuffling about in the candlelight. This, dear listener, was not insomnia, it was intermission. You see, in ye olden days, people commonly practiced what they called a first sleep and a second sleep, also known as biphasic sleep. The night was divided in two: a good 4 hours of initial slumber, followed by 1 or 2 hours of what was essentially medieval quiet time, a nocturnal halftime show, if you will, but with fewer fireworks and more spinning wool. The historian Roger Ekirch, who stumbled upon this pattern in diaries, legal records, and dreamily detailed medical manuscripts, found that between these two sleeps, people often read, prayed, talked with their spouses, smoked the occasional humble herb, or snuck across fields for a discreet rendezvous. Because, let's be honest, what better time for scandalous affairs and secret sausage theft than the witching hour, when everyone's supposed to be horizontal? Monks, of course, were champions of the night shift. Clocks hadn't yet become everyone's boss, but monasteries marched to the rhythm of the canonical hours. This meant being roused at unholy hours, ironically, for matins, midnight prayers, where habit-wrapped figures shuffled into cold stone chapels, yawning holy yawns and murmuring psalms with impressive cheerlessness. But it wasn't just monks and farmers embracing the split-sleep lifestyle. Aristocrats, if they weren't too busy poisoning each other or inventing new fork etiquette, also observed this nocturnal rhythm. Some wrote letters, others composed poetry. There is something undeniably romantic about composing a love sonnet at 2:13 a.m. while wearing a feathered nightcap and trying not to knock over the candle. Medical texts prescribed this midnight wakefulness as healthy, believing the period between sleeps was good for digestion, contemplation, and, yes, lovemaking. Physicians even warned against sleeping all the way through the night. What excess! Much better, they said, to wake up, discuss your dreams, or share a warm, fermented oat beverage with your bedmate. Incidentally, beds were not private kingdoms as they are today. Cold walls and crowded houses meant that people shared their sleeping spaces, often with extended family, guests, servants, and possibly Sebastian the goat. Let us pause to thank the passage of centuries for the wonder of personal space and goat-free duvets. Back then, darkness wasn't inconvenient. It was simply what the world became. Nightfall signaled a lull in life's tasks. Yes, but not a blackout. Without digital distractions or deadline anxiety, the quiet hours were a canvas for communion with the divine, the self, or, if one was lucky, a snoring spouse who didn't hog the straw mattress. So what happened to this elegantly lazy split snooze routine? The answer, as usual, involves progress, wires, and a suspiciously glowing filament. The invention of electric light did what no medieval curfew could. It banished the long, contemplative midnight interval. As evenings brightened and productivity crept deeper into the dark, people began cramming 8 hours of unconsciousness into one solid block. Efficiency had won, and with it, the end of second sleep. Still, on rare occasions, when you wake up at 2 a.m. and stare thoughtfully into your fridge, remember, you are continuing an ancient ritual, a sleepy secret once whispered in candlelit rooms. Perhaps your ancestors are applauding gently from the great beyond, or rolling their eyes because your intersleep activity involves frozen waffles and TikTok. Our dreams, fragmented or whole, often mirror the rhythms forgotten by time. And next, we shall drift toward the era when night became political. Where sleeping upright was safer, dreaming could get you arrested, and mattresses went to war. As the moonlight tiptoed across the thatched roofs of early medieval England, most of the village was already settling into its first slumber. Yes, I said first slumber, because surprise, at one time in history, humans simply didn't sleep all the way through the night. Instead, we slept in 2 delicious chunks, a first sleep, then a quiet, wakeful period in the middle of the night, perfect for praying, writing dreams into the margins of a sheepskin manuscript, inspecting the quality of your thatching by candlelight, or, more sensibly, visiting the privy before the frost made it unpleasant. Then came the second sleep, which carried folks gently into the morning. This segmented sleep was the norm in many parts of Europe for centuries, like a buy one get one free for your dreams. The medieval middle-of-the-night hours were considered fertile and magical. One 15th century manual advised that if you wanted your prayers answered, the hours between first and second sleep were prime time, an era when the heavens had their metaphorical call waiting switched off. We find mentions of this sleep pattern scattered throughout historical documents, from rustic English, court records to the journals of 17th century physicians who regarded midnight wakefulness not as insomnia, but as perfectly ordinary. No one fretted when they popped awake at 1:30 a.m. back then. There was no Dr. Sleep app, no bedtime podcast involving the soothing narrated history of bedroom slippers. Just peace, stars, and maybe a snoring spouse. But what, you ask, quietly I hope, caused this shift from 2 sleepy servings to one neat 8-hour package? Electricity. And coffee, but mostly electricity. Before light bulbs ruined everything in a perfectly well-lit way, darkness actually did something. It told your body to produce melatonin, the bedtime brain juice. Once the sun dipped below the peasant horizon, candles and hearth glimmered, but barely. And once those flickered out, sleep was inevitable. But from roughly the 1700s onward, humans got cocky. Urban centers grew, lanterns lined cobbled streets, and eventually, Thomas Edison gave the world the ability to host literary salons or spontaneous sock-darning sessions at 2 a.m. Artificial lighting extended the day far beyond nature's intentions. Humans began adjusting, and as a result, the natural dip in wakefulness that occurred during the night was increasingly ignored, or actively caffeinated through. Sleep became compressed and standardized. As the Industrial Revolution rolled in on its smoky chug-chug of progress, factory schedules demanded punctuality. And second sleep didn't pair well with a 6 a.m. shift. We needed predictable, unbroken slumber once the punch clock became law. Doctors, noticing that people were staying awake as if they had somewhere better to be, began calling this middle-of-the-night wakefulness a problem, attaching Latin names to it, and prescribing herbal tinctures or moral scoldings, depending on the century. Ironically, while everyone was trying to force themselves into a single block of slumber, with medications, monotony, and really dull novels involving the moral panorama of a Victorian teacup, many people didn't actually sleep better. We just decided the sleeplessness was a failing, rather than a long-lost midnight tradition we'd accidentally left behind, like a sock under a 17th century featherbed. And now, we stare into bright blue screens, binging historical documentaries about the invention of spoons, until it's 11:37 p.m, and our brains refuse to produce melatonin without a written apology. The magic hours between two sleeps have all but vanished from most cultures, though you might feel their echo on the occasional night when you wake, not startled or anxious, just quietly awake, mind adrift. That moment of stillness, when no email buzzes and no thought seems heavy, is the ghost of second sleep whispering, "Hey, remember me? Don't worry, we'll find our way back." In the meantime, as our sleepy journey continues through time, it's only fitting that we travel next to a place where sleep got fancy. Pillows started getting decorative, beds turned royal, and the nap suddenly became an art form worthy of palaces and poets. But we'll drift there gently, with your eyes just a little heavier, and dreams beginning to knock softly on the door. As the moon glided silently over medieval Europe, casting a silver hush across forests and thatched rooftops, a curious thing was happening inside households of wood and wattle. The people, our distant, cloaked, candlelit ancestors, were not sleeping the way we do. In fact, their slumber came in two neat acts, with a convenient pause in the middle. Yes, dear listener, medieval people essentially took a scheduled half-time break from sleep. Imagine waking up at 2 a.m., not because of a rogue snack craving or existential dread, but because it was simply what one did. They called them first sleep and second sleep. After the day's chores, people would collapse into bed sometime after dusk, entering their first hearty nap. But after a few hours, they'd naturally wake up, no alarm clocks needed, thank goodness, and spend an hour or two in a twilight wakefulness before drifting into their second sleep. It wasn't insomnia, it was tradition. What did they do during that curious gap, you wonder? Ah, now you're thinking like a proper historian. Well, they might stoke the hearth, perhaps write a letter by firelight, quills scratching gently against parchment, or ponder their dreams, which were, at that hour, considered unusually potent. Some used the time for prayer and meditation. Others, particularly in the countryside, paid visits to neighbours like night owlish hobbits with warm cloaks and long tails. And some indulged in a more passionate pastime lovingly nicknamed the best time for conception. Medieval folk really knew how to multitask their midnight. This segmented sleep wasn't limited to European peasants either. A 17th century doctor, one Robert Burton, whose beard probably contained an entire library of crumbs, wrote in The Anatomy of Melancholy that this in-between wakefulness was a time when many get up and go about their business, which, for Burton, meant reading obscure psychology in Latin for fun. Across the Channel, in France, the terms premier sommeil and second sommeil were just as commonplace. Parisian households, whether gilded or gritty, took their cue from the stars. Even the upper crust, dressed in lace nightcaps and perfumed robes, rose in the wee hours to reflect, roam, or occasionally pen morose poetry about moonlight and longing. 19th century Tumblr. Now, one might ask, why split up the night at all? Why not sleep in one luxurious, uninterrupted block like today's mattresses promise in their latest advertisements? Part of the answer lies in our biology. If you plop a group of people into total darkness for 12 hours a day, as researchers did in a famous 1990s sleep experiment, their sleep patterns eerily echo our medieval friends. First, a few hours of deep sleep. Then, a wakeful window of calm alertness. Then a second, shorter slumber. Left long enough, the modern brain reverts to these old rhythms, like it's been keeping a dusty manual hidden in the hypothalamus all this time. In medieval life, artificial light was scarce. Candles were a luxury. Oil lamps were finicky. And no one had invented scrolling TikTok until dawn. So when the sun dropped, the world simply dimmed. This natural darkness may have encouraged a more harmonious, fractured sleep cycle, one with a gentle intermission, like the universe hushed itself to a whisper so you could sip your mead and check in on yourself. Even more intriguing, this biphasic sleep didn't just fade into history, it lingered like the scent of wood smoke on an old cloak. Well into the 18th century, references to first and second sleep can be found in diaries, court records, and even crime stories. There's one particularly entertaining legal case where a man identified a thief because he'd gotten up during the in-between hours and glimpsed the bandit mid-burglary. Perhaps while scratching his beard and muttering, "Should have stayed in first sleep." But as the Industrial Revolution loomed, bringing with it factory bells and ever-buzzing street lamps, the lull between sleeps slowly vanished. People began squeezing slumber into one efficient span, like trousers into a suitcase. We began to prize productivity, and what could be more productive than pretending our bodies should function like factory machines? Still, if you've ever found yourself staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. with a curious sense of clarity or unease, perhaps it's just your ancient self, quietly returning for a visit. And on the note of flickering candlelight and quiet midnight interludes, let us now follow our story further into the heart of the sleeping mind itself. As the flickering candle of memory glows quietly over the 17th century, let's eavesdrop, for scholarly purposes of course, on a peculiar and now largely forgotten nightly habit: segmented sleep. Yes, before our modern devotion to the sacred 8-hour block, humans slept twice a night, not because they were up binge-watching year-older Netflix, but because it simply made sense for the world they lived in. Picture it. You're in a drafty wooden house somewhere in England. The fire's gone from blaze to a sigh of embers. The cow has stopped mooing its opinion on theology. It's midnight. This is when you awaken from your first sleep. Not groggy and confused like someone who pressed the snooze button 4 too many times, but calm, alert, ready for what was known as the watch. Rather than being haunted or inconvenient, this cozy bit of wakefulness was considered downright practical. People would use it to pray, read, stoke the fire, think deeply, like really deeply, or sometimes visit the neighbors for a bit of quiet company. Imagine walking to your neighbor's cottage at 1 a.m., wrapping your shawl a little tighter and knocking gently, only to be offered a mug of something warm and a casual chat about crop rotations or the local blacksmith's romantic missteps. Thomas Middleton, a 17th century playwright, casually noted in one of his works that a character had taken his first sleep, like it was as normal as washing your hands before dinner, or claiming you definitely had read that book you were assigned. Even in medical manuals of the time, physicians recommended using this interval to ease the body back into rest with some light reading, or perhaps a well-timed bout of marital bonding. Yes, dear listener, the midnight hour was a scientifically approved time for romantic frolicking. There are records, cited in footnotes and everything. In the quiet of this interval, the world glowed faintly by hearthlight or moonlight. You're half awake, entirely peaceful. It was a time suspended between the day's labors and tomorrow's tasks. It's hard to say exactly when we abandoned this intimate rhythm, but like so many old things, bronze helmets, Latin declensions, and satisfactory postal service, it faded gradually. By the Industrial Revolution, artificial lighting came marching in with all the subtlety of a brass band in a library. Gaslights were followed by electric bulbs, a marvel certainly, but also a rather bossy kind of miracle. Productivity became king, and a solid, unbroken night of sleep was suddenly hailed as the mark of a modern, efficient adult. The night, which once stretched itself out with room for wakefulness, rest, and dreams like lazy cats, became chopped neatly into one contiguous, well-behaved block. But even today, there's an echo of that old rhythm in our sleep cycles. Have you ever awoken at 2 a.m., not from a dream involving sentient tax forms or tumbling teeth, but peacefully, without much reason? Just awake? That, my friend, is your ancestral brain waving from the 1600s, inviting you to get up and pen a sonnet or reflect spiritually, or at least enjoy a banana. Researchers now call this historical pattern biphasic sleep, and far from being odd, it may actually have been humanity's default mode for thousands of years, which makes all of us modern monocycle sleepers grasping for our 8 hours as though they're the last cookie at a polite dinner party. A bit of an evolutionary detour. Cozy, isn't it, to think that once, even quite recently, the night was an open, gentle thing, meant to be savoured in 2 dreamy halves. First sleep brought the body its release, the watch gave the heart its solitude, and the second sleep offered passage back into dreams. And so, as we drift farther into this sleepy spiral through time's pillow-soft corridors, we reach a place where dreams themselves became a kind of nightlight, guiding societies not just through sleep but into strange new understandings of gods, guilt, and goats. Curious, is it not, what dreams do when history begins to yawn? But that, of course, is another night story. In the twilight hush of the 17th century, while monarchs quarrelled and merchants quibbled over peppercorn profits, something far more universal was puzzling the average person lying in bed. What exactly were we supposed to do with the long, looming night? You see, dear listener, sleep was not always the tidy, single-slice, 8-hour loaf we are told to bake today. For centuries, Many people preferred a sleep schedule that modernity would consider odd or mildly possessed. First sleep, then second sleep. Yes, 2 servings of slumber with a delicious creamy gap of wakefulness in between. It went something like this. People in pre-industrial Europe would nod off not long after nightfall, snuggling under scratchy wool, or, for the affluent, luxuriously itchy linen. Then, like clockwork, or rather, like candlewick, they would wake again around midnight. Not to panic, nothing as dramatic as insomnia. Just a soft, reliable intermission, a wakeful lull between Acts 1 and 2 of their nocturnal performance. What did one do at this midnight interlude? Well, quite a lot, surprisingly. Letters were written, bread was baked, some read scripture, others read less holy materials. Many turned to prayer. It was a precious pocket of time filled with reflection, quiet companionship, or if one was lucky, a little romance beneath the thatched roof beams. Historical sources hint that it was, in fact, a very popular time for what one might diplomatically call marital reconnection. This segmented sleep pattern wasn't just a European oddity. Similar habits have been documented across cultures and continents, from West African communities to pre-colonial America, where the night offered both shelter and stillness for the mind to drift gently between sleep and thought. But the 17th and 18th centuries were when this age-old rhythm began to unravel. And it all unraveled under the fluttering, marvelous chaos of artificial light. Please pause to imagine a street before gaslight. It would have smelled like horses and heard like boots. But more importantly, it would have vanished after sunset into a velvety darkness so complete you could lose your cows in it, and possibly your neighbour's cows too, depending on bovine ambition. Then came illumination. At first, it was modest. An oil lamp here, a candle sconce there. But then gaslight spread like gossip, and soon cities were glowing. Shops stayed open. Theatre curtain calls crept later. People extended their days, and in doing so, they compressed their nights. No more mid-sleep musing by firelight. No more 2-part slumber. The urban elite were some of the first to compress their sleep into a consolidated single block. Doctors, writers, even a few philosophically minded candle makers called it modern to sleep through the night in one luxurious stretch. Getting a full night's sleep became fashionable, and like powdered wigs and lace jabots, people clung to it merely because it seemed new and proper. Interestingly though, our brains did not necessarily get the memo. Scholars today argue that the body's natural sleep cycles, particularly in the absence of electric light, often secretly yearn for that ancient pause, for that liminal no man's land of quiet wakefulness, which does make you wonder. Perhaps those middle-of-the-night wake-ups people dread aren't failures at all, but little ancestral whispers, a biological invitation to reflect, stretch, sip water, or contemplate the geometry of ceiling shadows. Who's to say? And let's not forget, even as cities glimmered with gas-powered defiance against darkness, rural communities kept to older ways. In countryside cottages, 2 sleep nights lingered like an old song everyone still knew the chorus to. Farmers rose with stars, napped after supper, and still made room for a midnight meander to the barn or bedside prayer. It was a world gently turning between past and progress, where sleep itself was in transition. And so, in this chapter of lanterns and liminal hours, gaslight and gossip, we find humankind dreaming not just under the covers, but between them. A society softly releasing its old rhythms, even as it tried to convince itself that one neat sleep was better, cleaner, more civilized. By morning, however, even the most sophisticated candle-lit patrician would still wake up with their hair stuck to the side of their face and a sheepish yawn that reminded them human bodies, no matter how refined their waistcoats, are wonderfully stubborn creatures. Some old habits, even if buried under centuries and silk sheets, never quite leave us. And as we pull the covers up just a little higher, we might begin to wonder how timepieces, those ticking tyrants of modern life, would soon enter the bedroom and change the meaning of the midnight hour entirely. Let us slip now into the silken hush of the 17th century, a time when wigs got bigger, corsets got tighter, and insomnia was still politely called the devil's whisper. Candlelight flickered through velvet-draped chambers, and the air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts mingled with questionable hygiene. It's here, in the curling smoke of a colonial hearth, or perhaps beneath the low timbered ceiling of a sleepy English manor, that we begin to eavesdrop on one of sleep's most peculiar historical quirks: segmented slumber. You see, for a long, peculiar stretch of human history, the idea of sleeping in one solid chunk all through the night, as we do now, would have baffled your average 17th century Brit like asking them to explain quantum physics or dental hygiene. Back then, people often enjoyed not one, but two sleeps. That's right, a first sleep and a second sleep, separated by an hour or two in the middle of the night for chatting, loafing, praying, or simply contemplating life's greatest mystery. Why must chamber pots always be so splashy? Historians first stumbled upon this curious practice, not in medical texts or sleep studies, but in rustic diaries, court transcripts, and charming notes scribbled in Bibles by people who were supposed to be praying, but were evidently both devout and bored. Take the writings of Renaissance polymath Roger E. Kirch, who is very real and unmistakably named after a man who definitely owns a falcon. He compiled countless literary and historical references to first sleep and second sleep, showing that the practice was as common as lice and familial resentment in early modern households. Before the advent of the industrial lighting, the kind that brutally elbowed darkness out of the way, nights were long and time was elastic. People naturally fell asleep not long after nightfall, lulled by the gentle crackle of firewood and, on occasion, the rhythmic scribbling of monastic penmanship. After 4 hours or so, they'd wake, not with a start, but with a cozy sort of acceptance, as if their bodies had politely said, "And now, a brief intermission." During that wakeful pocket of night, which could last for up to 2 hours, folks wouldn't merely stare into the shadows and consider existential dread, as we might today. No, they made interesting use of the time. Some would get up to tend to small chores. Others would light a candle and read scriptures or recite psalms. Couples, meanwhile, were known to take advantage of this rather intimate window. Many texts discreetly refer to the most fruitful time for conception. And while we'll keep this bedtime tale suitably buttoned up, suffice it to say that snuggling was a popular nocturnal pastime. This two-sleep pattern wasn't exclusive to England. Similar habits were documented in continental Europe and even parts of Asia and Africa. It was like the historical version of a sleep buffet. A little now, a little later, and maybe some soft prayers as dessert. So what happened? Why did we lobotomize our nights into one tidy, industrial-sized sleep block? Enter artificial light, especially gas lamps, and, later, that luminous usurper of darkness, the electric bulb. As city life surged in the 18th and 19th centuries, so too did the night's productivity. Sleep no longer nestled itself into the rhythm of the stars. It had to hustle now, made to compete with social obligations, late-night publications, and finally, Netflix. Suddenly, lying awake at midnight wasn't holy or practical. It was pathological. Doctors, ever keen to give things impressive names, began labeling midnight wakefulness as sleep maintenance insomnia, which sounds rather like a bureaucratic plumbing issue. But in truth, it may just be the echo of an old rhythm, still lurking somewhere in our circadian bones. Even today, if you wake in the middle of the night, you might find your brain unusually sharp. Not anxious necessarily, just quietly alive with ideas or emotions that feel a touch more poetic than daytime allows. You may be, without knowing it, a sleeper out of time, walking in the ghost footsteps of villagers who rose at 2 a.m. to pray, or woodworkers who scribbled journal entries by candlelight, while waiting for second sleep to return. So if you happen to wake in the velvet hush of night, perhaps don't scold yourself. Perhaps instead, feel the gentle friendliness of it, as if night itself has come to share a secret long forgotten. And as we drift onward through the slow tide of history's dreams, we find ourselves drawn next to a place most devoted to slumber's mysteries, the bedside. But wait, not yours. No, we're reaching for the curious invention of the 18th century sleep gadgeteer, the people who tried to science their way into dreamland before sleep apps or melatonin bears. By the time bells were standardized across medieval Europe, used to corral monks, mark market hours, and signal the all-important soup lunch, humans had become surprisingly synchronized, at least in theory, and yet sleep, the great unregulated pastime, remained curiously chaotic. Much like everything else in the Middle Ages, sleep lacked a user manual. There were no firm bedtime routines, only vague suggestions from ecclesiastical authorities and the occasional physician who prescribed things like raw lettuce or lying on your right side to encourage peace of mind. Incidentally, lettuce was considered a mild sedative throughout antiquity. The Romans enjoyed a hearty salad before bed, which likely explains why so many marble statues look mildly sleepy. But around the 13th century, something fascinating began to unfold, not in public squares or religious debates, but in the quiet intimacy of the night. People began embracing what we now call segmented sleep, a 2-act performance of nightly slumber. Act 1, roughly 4 hours. Then came a gentle intermission, a twilight fugue of waking dreams and soft, lamplit puttering. People read, prayed, or simply lay still and thought about things, such as whether their neighbor's goose was plotting something. Eventually, Act 2 commenced, taking them back into sleep until the rooster called an insufferably early curtain. This wasn't some eccentric fad. It was just how sleep worked. The term first sleep appeared in letters, legal testimony, and even 15th century love poetry. There are accounts of couples talking quietly in candlelight during the middle of the night interlude, making plans, or, shall we phrase it delicately, performing domestic recreational activities. Why segmented sleep became so common is a bit of historical shrugging. Some believe it has evolutionary roots, a nod to our ancestors' need for part-time vigilance in the dark. Others point to environmental cues. Fires burned out, nights were long. The concept of 8 uninterrupted hours would have sounded as modern as a Bluetooth toaster. Interestingly, the liminal world between first and second sleep was considered spiritually fertile territory. Clergymen advised using that interval to pray, write in journals, or contemplate one's sins, which, in a medieval context, could range from gluttony to walking too briskly on holy days. Dream interpretation also flourished, aided by vivid recollections from those wakeful pockets. People described seeing saints, lovers, or their third best goat, all visiting in dreams that floated gently across that threshold of sleep. Imagine a medieval town on a cold winter's night. Straw roofs glisten faintly under moonlight. Inside one cottage, a family stirs between sleeps. A mother checks the hearth, feeding it a log with practiced grace. The father, blinking in the low amber glow, says something about oats. A child murmurs a half-coherent dream about dragons and turnips. Then, slowly, they drift back under, absorbed by rest's second chapter. This rhythm lasted for centuries. Shakespeare may have been born between first and second sleep. A whole generation of baking, churning, and quiet existential pondering once existed from roughly midnight to 2 a.m. And then, the Industrial Revolution, with all its gears and factory whistles, took a wrench, both literally and metaphorically, to the cycles of slumber. Artificial light, particularly gas lamps, and later Thomas Edison's more civilized wristwatch for the sun, began invading the dark. The night no longer belonged solely to dreams and goose-related paranoia. Cities stayed awake longer. Work shifts extended. Margins of rest were tightened. And over time, first and second sleep quietly merged like two acts whose playwright had suddenly stopped showing up. But as strange as this may sound to us now, modern science has begun to whisper that segmented sleep might make perfect biological sense. Some insomniacs find comfort in knowing that 2 a.m. wakefulness wasn't always a problem, but an ordinary part of living blanketed in seasons, candles, and the rhythmic exhale of the nearby barn cow. Next, we'll tiptoe into how cities, with their towering ambitions and caffeinated hubbub, turn sleep into both a commodity and a social battleground. By the late 1700s, the Age of Enlightenment was in full philosophical bloom, and while minds were illuminating all over Europe, sleep itself remained deliciously dark and mysterious. While Newton was inventing calculus and Voltaire was inventing complex dinner arguments, people were still mostly sleeping in cold, creaky beds with drafty ceilings and windows. You could hear the wind whistle through. But one curious thing was starting to change. Our good friend artificial light was growing up. It had started with candles, of course. Candles made from tallow if you were lower in the economic food chain, and beeswax if your dinner. Parties included powdered wigs and music by harpsichord. Tallow candles, to put it gently, smelled faintly of wet sheep and sang of economy. Beeswax candles smelled quite a bit lovelier and burned cleaner, giving the air of sophistication and debauchery at the same time, which is no small feat for a candle. But what truly began to poke the eye of nighttime was gaslight. Actual gaslight, not the modern sort where someone tells you that you're imagining the cat wearing boots. No, this gaslight was literal. In the late 18th century, cities began experimenting with coal gas to illuminate streets and interiors. One by one, little flickering flames began appearing in the previously starlit dark, like fireflies that had unionized and taken up permanent residence. Suddenly, with the twist of a valve and a whoosh of burning gas, the night was not so night-like anymore. This glow of civilization had, how should we put it, a very bright effect on sleep. You see, up to that point, people were still engaging in a curious sleep schedule known as segmented sleep. That's right. Before electricity and evening news programs chronically broadcasting doom at 10 p.m., our ancestors often slept in two chunks. First sleep lasted from dusk until somewhere near midnight. Then came a peaceful waking period, about an hour or two. This wasn't a time for checking emails or doom scrolling. No, it was contemplative. You might pray, read, or warm up a bowl of stew while watching the stars like a reflective goat-herd philosopher. Then came second sleep, which would carry you into morning with the grace of a marmot nestling into a pillow of moss, but with gaslight beginning to bathe drawing rooms in an amber glow. Sleep schedules began to shift. Society became enchanted with the sheer novelty of staying awake after dark. Theatres extended curtain calls. Taverns called last call later and later. And domestic life, previously governed by the setting sun, found itself with a fresh power to ignore planetary schedules altogether. People started going to bed later, and that gentle interval between first and second sleep began to shimmer and shrink. Newspapers at the time didn't fully grasp the cultural shift they were documenting. You might find an 1809 article that reads, "Thanks to the gaslighting along the high street, crime is down and the nighttime promenade is all the rage among fashionable types." What it doesn't say is that our national circadian rhythms were being sneaked away by the light, like a sock disappearing in the laundry. Of course, not everyone welcomed this luminous intrusion. The more medically minded like to point out that people were more tired, more irritable, and slightly more capable of using fatigue as a poetic excuse for everything. But modernity was striding forward with its shiny boots and bowler hats, and soon people accepted that nighttime could be as active, noisy, and illuminated as you were willing and financially able to make it. In wealthier homes, gaslight simmered like captive suns in glass fixtures, while curtains tried, unsuccessfully, to feign darkness. The poor still went to bed earlier, but now with a slightly smug knowledge that they were, perhaps inadvertently, the final defenders of segmented sleep, and so the human relationship with night, and with sleep itself, was changing again, not because of biology, but because of the flickering, hissing desire to chase productivity into the wee hours, to feed not just the mind, but the mechanisms of manufacturing, commerce, and gossip. Somewhere on a foggy London street, under the soft spill of a freshly installed gas lamp, a poet adjusted his cravat and squinted into the flame. He didn't know it yet, but sleep, as his grandfather had known it, was stepping into the wings, and like all grand performances, something new was about to take center stage. Softly waiting in the wings, the curious tale of how human beings learn to fear and then ignore. The dark is illuminated quite literally by firelight and the odd Victorian gas lamp. But before we luxuriated in the hum of ceiling fans and rechargeable nightlights in the shape of foxes, we had the Age of Enlightenment, an era when people believed reason would finally triumph over superstition, though, ironically, many of its thinkers still avoided walking alone at night, just in case reason hadn't finished triumphing just yet. By the 18th century, candles were no longer an extravagant indulgence reserved for monasteries and nobles with disturbingly drafty castles. Tallow, a polite term for exceptionally motivated cow or sheep fat, was now affordable, if not fragrant. This allowed more households to keep a warm flicker burning long into the night, not so much for romance, but to avoid tripping over chamber pots or mistaking a cat for a ghost. A common mistake, especially with cats. The evolution of post-sunset activities was unfolding gently and surprisingly quickly. In urban centres like London and Paris, streets began to be lit by oil lamps, then gas, sending a glowing ripple effect straight into people's bedrooms, with lamplighters scurrying about at dusk to perform their delicate, smoky work. the lines between day and night began to blur. People stayed awake longer. Some began sleeping in just one long stretch, instead of the classic first sleep and second sleep model that had reigned since medieval times. Now, the term first sleep wasn't a marketing campaign for mattresses, though it would have made a good one. It was literal. People would go to bed shortly after dusk, sleep deeply for a few hours, wake up around midnight, and then do stuff. Write letters, pray, stoke the fire, craft awkward poetry for their cousins. This happened more than you'd think. Or visit neighbors. That's right. Night visits were a thing. Imagine showing up at your neighbor's front door at 1 a.m. just to have tea and discuss the recent scandal involving Lord Featherington's unorthodox cheese rituals, but with artificial light casting a more assertive glow over nightlife. Those cozy in-between hours started to fade. By the time the Enlightenment was shaping society's clockwork, people began adjusting to a single consolidated sleep. It was seen as more modern, more productive, and quite possibly less likely to result in unexpected visitors pestering you with sleep-deprived conspiracy theories about turnips. Here, we must give the philosophers some credit and some side-eye. Thinkers like Benjamin Franklin, who famously slept only 4 hours a night but made time to flirt diplomatically with just about everyone in Paris, promoted personal discipline and industriousness. Sleep was about efficiency now. Even dreams, previously considered potential divine messages, or, at minimum, free entertainment, were demoted to neural housekeeping. A shame, really. No one's made a decent myth out of neural housekeeping. Still, the shift from segmented to unified sleep was not immediate, nor universally embraced. In the countryside, and honestly, in most households outside of major cities, people clung to divided nights for quite some time. Farmers still rose before dawn, and their beds still creaked under the weight of quilts, exhaustion, and the confused mutterings of someone waking up between sleeps, wondering whether it was morning or just the hour when foxes laugh at you in Latin. What is striking, perhaps, is how sleep, a biological imperative, was so easily reshaped by social structures and flickers of innovation. Sleep, once dictated by the sun and the moon, was being scheduled not by stargazers or druids, but by coal soot and candle wax economics. Naturally, not everyone appreciated this evolution. Some poets and physicians worried that cramming all rest into one long stretch was unnatural. The body needs its sacred midnight pondering, one 18th century clergyman wrote, possibly right before sneaking a midnight snack. Nonetheless, the tides of modernity were lapping at the feather-down shores of sleep. And so, in these enlightened times, where no shadow went unscanned and no nap unjudged, the very way we slept began to shift. Again, one might be tempted to say it was all downhill from there, if not for the fact that the 19th century would soon offer us sleeping pills, Victorian fainting couches, and the strange case of people who slept sitting upright because they believed it kept the lungs from collapsing in a scandalous heap. But we'll drift toward that part of the story very gently, with our slippers on, and a candle just bright enough to light the way. Centuries ago, when the streets of Paris were quieter and the moonlight spilled like spilled milk across stone alleys, something peculiar began happening in the realm of sleep practices. It was not an invention, not a revolution, but a curious social ripple that began whispering through the chambers of the French aristocracy. Why not take a nap at night? Of course, we sleepy historians refer to this odd phenomenon as segmented sleep. And dear listener, it wasn't born in Paris at all. It had been nestled in human behavior for centuries. millennia even, long before the Enlightenment crowd learned to use it as an excuse to philosophize in silk pajamas. You see, prior to the invention of electric light, that marvel which gave us endless evenings filled with more mail, humans' internal clocks followed the beat of the sun. Without screens or fluorescents to drag us past dusk, we typically slept in 2 cozy installments through the night. The first sleep began shortly after sundown. Then came a gentle awakening, an interlude ripe for contemplation, fire tending, or, as some manuscripts whisper with feathery scandal, marital activity. This intersleep period, often falling somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m., was so socially recognized and routine that it earned its own nickname, the watch, which sounds vaguely like either an antique timepiece or a very sleepy night patrol. People would rise quietly, move about the house in soft slippers. Well, if you were fancy enough to own slippers, and write letters, light candles, or simply sit in reflective prayer. The medieval version of doom scrolling really, but with a bit more incense and fewer cats falling off countertops. The second sleep, known imaginatively as, well, second sleep, would then carry the dreamer gently through until dawn. This rhythm was particularly prevalent in pre-industrial societies, whose days were defined by sunlight and sweat, not calendars and coffee. A 16th century Englishman named Roger E. Kirch, yes, delightfully enough, that is a modern historian rifling through ancient life, discovered references to this bifurcated slumber in court records, diaries, and literature, where characters routinely mention waking after first sleep as though it were as common as brushing one's teeth today, which, for the record, wasn't particularly common back then, but more on that another time. Even Chaucer, that bard of bemused humanity, hinted at this pattern in the Canterbury Tales, portraying characters who rose in the middle of the night as thoughtful, romantic, or just needing a snack. But all good things must be electrified. With the Industrial Revolution and the invention of artificial lighting, humanity's relationship with night was rewired. Gas lamps and later, Thomas Edison's cheery little light bulbs began to stretch the day unnaturally. Workdays grew longer. Nightlife sprouted in the glowing twilight. Sleep, once sprawling and sophisticated in its 2-part form, was now pressured into a tidy, efficient monoblock. 8 hours, no breaks, no intermission. Just snooze hard and hit the factory floor by dawn. The sleepless nights of the Victorian era especially admired this newly compressed sleep schedule, as if it were a sign of moral superiority. If you only woke once, you were focused, disciplined, possibly an accountant. Segmented sleep, like powdered wigs and leeches as medicine, faded into the mists of time. But here's a dreamy twist. Modern sleep researchers are now peeking back into those Middle Ages sleep logs with curiosity, wondering if those sleepy peasants knew something we forgot amid the buzz of electric bills. Could it be, some suspect, that segmented sleep is the natural way our bodies wish to rest? That waking quietly in the dark isn't insomnia, it's just a built-in pause from the theatre of dreams, and perhaps that strange comfort we feel at 3 a.m, when the world is hushed and the shadows listen, isn't loneliness, but a return to something old, familiar, a shared moment with our medieval cousins. As we slip deeper into this flickering past, it's time to close the shutters of our minds and follow the candlelit trail a little further. Now that dreams have begun to whisper again, let's wonder where they lead. By the time medieval Europe began snoring beneath thatched roofs and castle ramparts, something peculiar ruled the darkness. Curfews rang like bells. candles flickered out by decree, and public yawning, though not outlawed, may as well have been the national sport. Sleep in these centuries wasn't yet the modern marathon of unconsciousness we know today. It was more of a relay race between two nighttime sprints, commonly called first sleep and second sleep. Yes, for hundreds of years, people didn't hunker down for 8 uninterrupted hours. They slept in 2 acts, with a cozy little intermission designed apparently for reflection, spiritual reading, or faintly cursing the livestock next door. The term curfew itself came from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. It was, rather helpfully, a bell that tolled through the twilight air, reminding villagers to extinguish their fires before bed. Fire, you see, had the bad habit of not staying where you left it. One distracted peasant and your thatched village became a bonfire with unfortunate consequences for bedtime routines. But the medieval mind didn't think of sleep as a single chunk of rest. Instead, they curled under woolen blankets shortly after sundown, snuggled beside family members, pets, or possibly a travelling bard if the inn was full. After sleeping for 4 or 5 hours, they'd wake, quite naturally, around midnight. No alarm clock required. What did they do during this dusky liminal space? Well, a little of everything. Some prayed, some talked, deeply, in whispers that carried weight only the half asleep can achieve. Some snuck outside to check on wayward sheep. Others may have simply stared at the ceiling, mulling over dreams or medieval plumbing, which consisted largely of not having any. Historians, who appeared to get considerably more sleep than medieval people, dug up references from diaries and texts that mentioned this nighttime intermission with the same casual familiarity we might talk about brushing our teeth. The term first sleep appears in Chaucer's writing, in medical treatises, even in court testimonies where someone's alibi rested on the fact that they were engaged in second sleep at the time of the alleged chicken theft. This 2-stage slumber wasn't limited to Europe either. There are whispers of segmented sleep in early African and Middle Eastern societies too, as though humanity collectively decided around the world that 2 a.m. was a perfect time for a bit of journaling. It makes one wonder, were they onto something? Modern scientists have gone poking around in this topic. In laboratories bathed in gentle lamplight, volunteers were subjected to medieval-style darkness, 14 hours of it, day after day, with no phones, no crime dramas, and certainly no streetlights polluting their pineal glands. After a few weeks of confusion, the participants began to naturally adopt biphasic sleep, drifting into first sleep, waking for an hour or two, and then drifting back off again until morning. Their bodies, absent the artificial glare of modernity, slipped into historical rhythm. They were, in essence, sleeping like it was 1399 again, minus the bubonic plague and questionable dental care. It's tempting to imagine someone like Brother Alaric, a portly monk in woolen robes, lighting a candle in the pitch-dark monastery around midnight. Perhaps he'd brew a dubious herbal tea, scratch his beard contemplatively, and pen some lines of illuminated manuscript, blissfully unaware he was living out a now-forgotten science experiment in biphasic rest. But like most things, the 2-sleep system faded. As street lighting appeared, as cities stayed awake longer, and as coffee became the global deity it is today, sleep squished itself into one uninterrupted lump. It became more efficient, more standardized, and just a tiny bit less poetic. And so, tucked under flickering candlelight and the occasional owl hoot, our ancestors yawned their way through segmented dreams and softly whispered conversations, crafting a kind of sleep that flowed in chapters, like a cozy book beside the hearth. Now, as embers of this medieval habit flicker in your mind, and the idea of a midnight tea suddenly seems quite reasonable, we'll drift into another moment of dreamy exploration. Just beyond the curfew's bell, let's float now, with a minimal effort, into the candlelit corridors of the early 1800s, a time when petticoats rustled like wind through paper and men's hats had brims wide enough to block both the sun and unsolicited opinions. In this drowsy stretch of human existence, a sly, silent revolution was flickering into life, one that would forever change how we drift into slumber. Gaslight. Yes, before it became a dramatic metaphor for questionable behavior in emotionally murky relationships, gaslight was literally what glowed near your boots as you strolled the sooty streets of London or Paris with your monogrammed walking stick and vague existential dread. Humans had finally mastered the ability to illuminate the night, not with flaming torches or oil that made everything smell like lightly roasted walrus, but with a clean, dry flame that hissed politely from iron lamps. And just like that, everything shifted. It's difficult, from our modern perch atop memory foam and screen fatigue, to fully grasp how profound a change this was. For millennia, nightfall had meant the end of human productivity, not because people were lazy, but because there's only so much you can do by the flicker of a wax stump and a sincere prayer that your house doesn't burn down. But now, thanks to the work of engineers with soot in their pockets and dreams in their eyes, cities no longer slept when the sun did. Factories began running after dark. Shops started staying open just a little longer. And socializing in the evening no longer meant squinting at someone across a dim parlor and hoping you hadn't accidentally started chatting up a hat rack. Still, the biggest shift was more intimate, more quiet, and largely unnoticed by its participants. See, with light extended into the night, bedtime stretched later and later. Those relaxing pre-sleep hours, the ones folks once spent whispering stories, shuffling cards, or boiling dubious herbs to dip a crust of bread in, were now filled with actual activities. People read novels, wrote letters, stared suspiciously at their canaries. In essence, the dark no longer dictated the rhythm of rest. It wasn't all bad, of course. In fact, this dimly glowing innovation made evening hours more civilized. Before gaslight, wandering the streets after sunset was essentially a dare. A whimsical bet with fate that you wouldn't fall into a trench or be serenaded by a very confident rat. Gaslight provided guidance, warmth, and a certain poetic gleam for late-night poets and unusually punctual pickpockets. In bustling cities like London and New York, the introduction of gaslight also sparked the rise of what we now lovingly call evening culture. Opera houses twinkled with chandeliers, pubs began to host long-winded debates about sheep taxes, and in more respectable circles, salons filled with the chatter of scholars, thinkers, and that one guest who always brought up astrology when no one asked. But while our cities lit up, our inner clocks stumbled slightly. Humans, who'd once followed the rising and setting sun like loyal sunflowers, were now negotiating their sleep with something altogether new: human-engineered evening. And so the age-old habit of segmented sleep, remember, that quaint practice of sleeping in two distinct chunks through the night, began to falter. With more to do and more reasons to delay bedtime, people increasingly pushed their sleep into a single long stretch, neatly packaged into the soon-to-be modern idea of a consolidated 8-hour slumber. This wasn't a swift change, mind you. It arrived gently, like tea cooling on a saucer, largely ushered in by the softly hissing presence of gaslight along the streets and sconces. Now you might wonder, did people rejoice at the newfound convenience? Did humanity collectively stretch, yawn, and marvel at their illuminated evenings? Well, sort of. They certainly liked the glow, but they also wrote hand-wringing essays about how artificial light might be encouraging sloth, unwholesomeness, and possibly impromptu dancing. As it turns out, every technological shift arrives with moral panic, neatly gift-wrapped in rhetorical flourishes. One reverend in Boston declared street lighting to be a temptation from the nocturnal devils, which sounds dramatic until you realize his sermons were probably scheduled just before bedtime. Still, light had spoken. Sleep patterns, ever so gradually, listened. As the flame of gaslight mingled with the dreams of a newly electrified world, our old friend the night would never be quite the same. And somewhere in the gentle hum of late evening footfalls, the stage was quietly being set for the invention of something even brighter, even more commanding, and so very, very hard on the sleep-deprived, the birth of electric light. But that glowing tale awaits just ahead, in the next hush of twilight. Somewhere in the soft, candle-flickering murk of the 18th century, a rather unexpected figure began meddling in the age-old business of bedtime. The postal clerk. Yes, the post. That famously thrilling government institution, known for its romantic involvement with letters, stamps, and, rather suddenly, sleep. See, for most of the human history, nighttime was a mysterious stretch of hours to be navigated gingerly, like a shadowy hallway of unknown dangers and misplaced chamber pots. But then something happened. Cities got louder, and they got later. And as cities grew, so too did the thirst for communication. Soon, people were no longer content to wait until sunrise for news of Aunt Mildred's gout, or the latest scandal involving a horse, a bishop, and 3 pounds of goose fat. The postal system mushroomed with purpose. Mail routes stretched farther. Sorting offices buzzed with activity. And with the growing importance of night mail, a peculiar social shift began. Sleeping through the entire night started to seem inefficient. In England, night mail trains zipped across the country like caffeinated clockwork beetles. Launched in 1838, the night mail service provided overnight delivery long before anything as glamorous as tracking numbers or accidental packages of live eels. These thundering iron carriages were rallying through the countryside while most people were still merrily tucked under their scratchy woolen blankets, dreaming of well-behaved hedgehogs and turnip festivals. Postal clerks, dressed in their sensible waistcoats and stoic expressions, toiled in the rolling train cars with the kind of dedication normally reserved for saints and people trying to win crossword competitions. In fact, the Royal Mail even fitted entire sorting offices into the train cars, with employees hurling letters into pigeonholes as though their lives, and perhaps their pensions, depended on it. And their nocturnal labours had a curious ripple effect. Suddenly, the idea of staying up late gained a certain prestige. If the postmen were working all night for the good of the empire, surely others could spare an hour or two for society chatter, astronomical observations, or filing increasingly creative tax documents. Salons and coffee houses began to compete with the moon itself. Gathering places like London's famed Button's Coffee House became all-night operations, brimming with poets armed with terrible quills and shaky metaphors, debating life's biggest questions. What is truth? Should trousers be optional? And has anyone fed Johnson's parrot? In Paris, cafes glowed long after sunset, their doors open to philosophers drunk musicians, and moderately confused tourists seeking the powdered wig district. This was the Enlightenment after all, when humanity decided to stay up late with candles and cleverness, and to ask very pointed questions about kings, divinity, and why bread cost a month's wages. France, ever the stylish innovator, even introduced the art of the soirée. These sophisticated evening gatherings were equal parts theatre, intellectual duel, and mild flirtation. People sipped wine, pondered Voltaire, and nodded sagely at things they didn't quite understand, usually around 11:30 p.m., well into what their medieval ancestors would have considered ghost hour. And so, the divide between day and sleep began to blur. Not with a bang, but with a well-timed toast and another round of letters sent overnight. It was as if society had collectively decided that darkness wasn't the enemy. It was just a canvas, a time not only for rest, but for reinvention. Of course, sleeping through the night was still a goal for many, but the sacred silence once guarded by oil lamps and chicken fear had now been punctured by railway whistles, candle-lit arguments about Rousseau, and very punctual postal routes. Even dreamers huddled in their beds might have found sleep a bit trickier with trains rattling past and pamphlets slipping through mail slots like gossipy ghosts. The world, it seemed, was learning to live and occasionally overthink at night, and thus, with every clattering letter sorted under the stars, the illusion of all-night rest grew a little fuzzier. The age of convenience had beckoned in its nightgown. But how did industrial light, those little electric suns, change our dreams forever? Oh, for that, you'll want to keep your curiosity tucked in tight and follow where the wires glow next. Back in the velvet hush of the 19th century, long before blue light tortured the retinas of the modern insomniac, a curious social development nestled into the British nighttime like a well-fluffed down pillow. The invention of what we might call middle-class insomnia. But lest that sound vaguely modern or, heaven forbid, trendy, allow me to explain the quaint and anxiously embroidered truth. In the Victorian era, sleeplessness began slipping into fashion, not unlike waistcoats, gout, or the polite dread of France. Gone were the medieval days when nobody expected you to sleep straight through the night. In centuries prior, 2 sleeps were normal: a hefty first sleep, followed by a peaceful middle-of-the-night waking period, perfect for stoking the fire, praying, or considering the existence of God and whether the chickens would survive the frost. But by the time Queen Victoria herself was staring sternly out from every coin and biscuit tin, society had embraced the notion that one should sleep all in one neat, uninterrupted go. Efficiency had arrived, on trains, in factories, and now, tragically, in bed. Physicians of the era began prescribing single sleep schedules with the enthusiasm of someone who's just discovered seltzer water. These were the same doctors who sometimes handed out cocaine for coughs, so one might take their advice with a gently raised eyebrow. Nevertheless, they proclaimed that proper sleep came in an 8-hour slab, preferably uninterrupted by pesky middle-of-the-night musings, ghost sightings, or existential reflection. To awaken at 2 a.m. and talk to one's spouse about crop yields or the possibility of fairies in the wood was now considered an unfortunate ailment, perhaps traceable to dietary imbalances, poor moral fiber, or the pernicious influence of Italian opera. And so, society adjusted. Beds grew firmer, rules multiplied, caffeine was eyed with suspicion, and upper-class folks began viewing sleep not as a natural rhythm, but as an aspirational achievement. Like playing the harpsichord, knowing Latin, or owning a butler with sideburns majestic enough to attract songbirds. Yet, for all the emphasis on proper sleep, Victorian bedrooms were not particularly restful. Curtains were heavy enough to choke a small horse. Drafts behaved like tiny ghosts determined to haunt only your ankles. And privacy was a luxury, not a guarantee, especially if you lived in one of those massive family homes where someone was always peeking through a keyhole, be it a child, a footman, or a disapproving aunt named Mildred. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution had flung its sooty arms around the working classes, whose sleep schedules were less about ideal REM cycles and more about collapsing in a heap. Long factory hours ensured that many people did sleep through the night, but not out of convenience or design, simply out of sheer bone-deep exhaustion. By the late 1800s, sleep manuals started appearing like mushrooms after a damp fortnight. Their titles, delightfully unpunctuated and unnecessarily long, sounded like something screamed from a train platform. On the restoration of the mind by means of Morphean contemplation, with suggestions regarding the attenuation of nervous disturbance in the night hours. Catchy, right? People were advised to eliminate vigorous thought after dusk, lest their brains misbehave. Bedtime routines were encouraged. Reading a soothing chapter of Marcus Aurelius, sipping a tepid glass of milk, then lying perfectly still while silently questioning all past choices. There were some who rebelled, of course. Poets, novelists, those delightful night-dwelling odd ducks who preferred the wee hours for brooding, writing, and staring dramatically out of windows while monocles fogged gently in the gaslight. And society needed them, even if it accused them quietly of being peculiar. Much of what we today call sleep hygiene can be traced to this period. Concepts like going to bed at the same time each night, making the bedroom a sanctuary, and avoiding spicy mutton immediately before bed took root among those who could afford to care. So, as the century drew its long velvet curtain across the lamplit world, Victorian sleepers found themselves betwixt tradition and modernity, still floating in lace-trimmed nightshirts, still haunted by ancient midnight instincts, yet freshly burdened with the suspicion that sleep too must now be optimized. But don't you worry, dear listener. Everything settles with time, as you shall soon see, in the next soft, drifting chapter. Somewhere in the 18th century, in the shadowy afterglow of Enlightenment logic and increasingly fussy hair powder, people began formalizing what had always been done: going to bed. Yes, bedtime. Once a natural meander into slumber wrapped in community rituals and firelight, was now becoming a matter of disciplined routine, full of ticking clocks, polite yawns, and vague concern about the moral perils of night owl behavior. This was, after all, the age of reason. And reason, apparently, required a firm 8 hours to function properly. Philosophers, scientists, and snoring tailor apprentices alike began to adapt to the rhythms of standardized time. That invention so earnest, it tried to make people feel bad for not being sleepy at exactly 10 p.m. Before all this precision, sleep had often been biphasic, split into 2 distinct acts. There was the first sleep, a rich, dreamy nap starting a few hours after nightfall, and then the second sleep, which picked up after a cozy, candlelit interlude. During this magical gap in the wee hours, people did all kinds of civilized things: praying, meditating, cuddling, occasionally sneaking off for a romantic rendezvous, or sneaking back in from one, depending on their role in the story. But as cities hummed louder and gaslights flickered across cobblestone streets like clockwork fireflies, this elegant 2-act performance began condensing into a single, more tidy stretch. all the better for factory shifts, or sermon attendance, or the invention of the morning meeting, which, historians agree, may be humanity's least appreciated contribution to shared suffering. Somewhere in a dim London parlour, a man named Samuel Tissot, a Swiss doctor who took the idea of earnest pamphlets to dizzying heights, warned that irregular sleep might confuse the body's humours. People were still quite worried about humours. Not the funny kind, but the bodily fluids kind. There wasn't a pun to be found in them. Meanwhile, over in Paris, Voltaire was probably sipping dubious coffee and arguing with someone into the small hours, engaging in what the Enlightenment folk did best, debating everything, including waking up. But society was shifting. Candles grew cheaper, timepieces ticked louder, and somewhere, a gentle librarian in Vienna invented the subtle art of yawning in Gregorian tempo. Evening itself was becoming performative. There were afternoon teas, supper clubs, salon lectures, and early attempts at entertainment that did not involve people falling off carts or being chased by geese. By the late 1700s, staying up late was no longer suspicious. It was fashionable. And then came the middle class. The beautiful engine of standardization. Industrious, punctual, faintly nervous. The rise of middle-class respectability brought with it a growing concern for productive sleep. It had to be regular, efficient. Dreaming wildly was fine, as long as it fit into a sensible schedule and didn't interfere with rising promptly at dawn. Dreams of flying, acceptable. Dreams of talking to your cousin's ferret at 2 a.m, concerning. Doctors, ever eager to impose boundaries on the mysteries of unconsciousness, began recommending strict lights-out practices. Don't read before bed, too stimulating. Don't eat too late, too disruptive. Don't engage in interpretive dance on the lawn, too French. Though to be fair, that last one was rarely published. In the soft arms of the Industrial Revolution, the practice of sleeping through the night became less of a personal journey and more of a standardized ritual. People no longer just slept because the sun had gone down. They slept because the bell would ring in 6 hours and they'd be expected to shovel coal, operate a textile machine, or file something on a very high shelf with astonishing urgency. And as clocks grew pocket-sized, the tyranny of time marched right into bedrooms. The working man, and increasingly the working woman, lay their heads on pillows stuffed with goose feathers and economic anxiety, adjusting their internal gears to match the world's growing insistence on linear slumber. Still, even in this structured age, something dreamy lingered. In certain quiet homes, journal entries of the era confessed to midnight meanders, gentle bedroom whispers, or walks taken beneath moonlight in slippers, far too impractical for actual exercise. Though sleep was compressed, the dreamer's heart was not. People still drifted, wondered, sighed into the night, and sometimes, just sometimes, found their way back to those old winding hours between the first sleep and the second, where the world paused and the soul hummed softly in time with the stars. And so, as the candles flickered low and the streets outside whispered with the faint clip of hooves and ambition, the idea of a normal night's sleep took deeper root in culture's soil. But something else was brewing, flickering on the edge of the electrical age, glowing faintly like stardust in a light bulb filament. And that is a story best left for dust tomorrow. As the sun set on the 19th century, humanity was tucking itself into bed with unprecedented coordination. Cities now buzzed with electric lights, factories thrummed like mechanical lullabies, and the notion of bedtime had unified itself into a kind of societal choreography. Gone were the segmented sleeps of medieval folk, who once dozed in 2 discrete rounds separated by late-night snack and chat interludes. No, by the late 1800s, people in much of the Western world had embraced the 8-hour straight shot, or at least they'd convinced themselves they were supposed to. But sleep, like fashion and facial hair trends, is notoriously resistant to regulation. And once the Industrial Revolution had cranked society into a new tempo, people found themselves negotiating a fresh tension, the tug of war between circadian rhythm and the factory whistle. This period saw the rise of the ever-drowsy clerical worker, a novel character in the grand soap opera of labour history. Before this, work might have meant ploughing fields, hauling barrels, or yelling, "Bring out your dead," before sunup. Now, it meant sitting still under gaslight with very scratchy collars and absolutely no opportunity to nap discreetly. The struggle was real, and it yawned deeply. Enter the great sleep reformers of the 19th century. Social thinkers, doctors, and even mattress manufacturers began publishing persuasive arguments on the benefits of sensible sleep. Health reformers, like the delightfully named Sylvester Graham, of Graham Cracker fame, believed good sleep hygiene was the key to moral purity. He advocated for early bedtimes, cold showers, and quite tragically, the removal of all spicy foods. Sleep, he said, must be bland and orderly, like his crackers. Meanwhile, mesmerists and phrenologists were floating in another dreamy orbit. Hypnosis was all the rage, and not just at carnivals. Middle-class parlour rooms hosted evening demonstrations where you might find your neighbour Horace being gently lulled into a trance by a man with far too much moustache. These early hypnotists saw sleep as a powerful portal to the subconscious, or, at the very least, an excellent party trick after the jellied eels had been served. At the same time, increasingly noisy cities, with their trains, trolleys, and temperamental gaslights, required people to invent new strategies for falling asleep. Thus began the golden age of sleep aids, with suspicious tonics of morphine and laudanum available in any decent apothecary. The labels read like bedtime poetry: soothing syrup for infants, gentleman's night rest, and the ever-popular Dr. Worthington's tranquil elixir, which contained as much opium as a minor Greek tragedy. In homes, ear trumpets and curtain weights gave way to a new invention: the sleepwear revolution. The nightcap, both garment and beverage, reached peak popularity. Bedclothes grew more elaborate, with monogrammed dressing gowns and enormous sleep bonnets that resembled upside-down tulip pots. Pillows multiplied like rabbits, and wealthy sleepers could embrace the new bourgeois ritual of preparing for bed, an activity lasting anywhere from 20 minutes to a solid hour and requiring assistance, candlelight, and ideally, someone named Florence. But while the upper classes were fluffing eiderdowns, factory workers were navigating a far less dreamy sleep culture. Night shifts were becoming common. Gas lamps allowed for 24-hour productivity, and employers, in their unique kindness, expected employees to adjust accordingly. Now, humanity found itself collectively yawning down a rabbit hole. Our natural sleep cycles, tuned across millennia to the gentle rhythm of sun and moon, were scrambling to catch up with a world lit by coal, kerosene, and eventually, Thomas Edison's proud little bulbs. Ah yes, Edison, that tireless tinkerer who famously proclaimed that sleep was a waste of time and that 4 hours per night was plenty. He kept a cot in his workshop for catnaps, swore off full nights, and insisted everyone else was just being lazy. A sentiment easy to express when you've invented a way to work well past sundown. And so, the culture of ambition crept quietly into our beds, whispering that to sleep too long was a kind of sloth. By 1900, sleep wasn't just about rest anymore. It was about efficiency, productivity, and being alert enough to schedule a luncheon via telegraph. Still, despite the hustle and bustle, humanity proves stubbornly somnolent. We love our dreams too much to give them up entirely, it seems. And when curtains at last were drawn, we'd still drift, slower now, heavier, minds full of electric thoughts and waking clocks, to our age-old truce with the dark. The night, as always, remained patient, and in the final act of our sleepy saga, we turn our gaze to the age of sleep science, when men and women with clipboards and wires began to peer, ever so gently, into the mysteries behind our eyelids. By now, you may have settled deep into your pillow's sweet embrace, your mind adrift on a gentle tide of historical absurdity. Perhaps you've already forgotten the Romans' togas as nightgowns, or how Victorians feared sleeping near wallpaper more than ghosts. But before the last candle flickers out, there's one final quiet tale in this moonlit museum of humanity's slumber saga. A tale about where we are now in this age of Wi-Fi dreams and robot vacuums that hum lullabies to the cat at 3 a.m. Let us drift, just briefly, into the modern world, the one you know, where electric light still blazes far too boldly into the night, and we fumble at 2 a.m. for our glass of water, only to knock over a phone, a book, and perhaps a small, disgruntled pet. Yes, we are in the era of the great bedtime struggle. But history, as ever, is right there with us, chuckling softly in the background, sipping something herbal. You see, despite our fancy mattresses with memory foam thicker than the Magna Carta, and sleep apps that whisper rainforests into our ears, we're not entirely at peace with the bedtime condition. Around the world, billions still dance that timeless tango, eyelids heavy, brain chatty, and an unwelcome to-do list performing pirouettes. Somehow, we've made beds more expensive and sleep more elusive. Quite the achievement, really. Blame it on the light bulb, if you'd like. When Thomas Edison proudly banished darkness in the 19th century, he didn't quite realize he might also be banishing humanity's ability to hit the snooze button. Poor Thomas, robbed of the full REM cycle he never knew he missed. Modern sleep scientists now whisper what our ancestors already kind of knew, that we're still creatures of light, of rhythm, of moon-chased dreams. In fact, you may recall, well, someone might recall, that before electric lights, sleep often happened in phases. A first sleep, and then a dreamy twilight wakefulness, where folks would tend the fire, chat with neighbors in hushed voices, or write suspiciously romantic poetry. It was social, serene, dare we say, mildly seductive. You could nap your way to enlightenment, but the modern world, helpful as ever, offered us something else. The 8-hour block, mass-manufactured and FDA unapproved. Suddenly, we all needed to sleep like factory shifts. Start at 10, wake at 6, repeat forever. Any deviation was seen as suspect. Medieval peasants with their midnight musings. Clearly amateurs. We had work to do. Mondays to dread. Coffee to worship. And yes, coffee. How could we forget this jittery potion, imported, adored, and wholly responsible for civilization's morning meetings and mild existential anxiety? When the Ottomans brewed it over campfires, sharing stories beneath star-smoked skies, they likely didn't imagine its future. Served lukewarm in cardboard cups, clenched in the fist of an intern sprinting for the train. Yet still, somehow, despite alarms, screens, snacks, and the occasional existential dread, humans do find their way to sleep. sometimes not where or when we planned. Nodding off during history lectures, no offense. Fainting in dentist chairs, or dozing off midway through putting our phone down, but never quite succeeding. The body is patient, the mind persistent. Our ancient desire to close our eyes and wander into dream hasn't vanished. It's just negotiating with Netflix now. Consider, if you will, the humble yawn. A universal symbol stretching untouched across centuries and continents. Rich people yawn. Poor people yawn. Pharaohs yawned in gold-drenched tombs, and Antarctic explorers yawned into beards frozen solid as irony itself. Yawning is our last primal protest before surrendering to the night. A tiny, open-mouthed reminder that, at the end of the day, we are all just sleepy mammals in need of a cuddle and a plot twist. And just like that, we close the pages of this bedtime anthology. The heroes were never crowned emperors. The villains were often candles, flakes of lead, or an ill-timed rooster. But it was always, above all, a story about how we've tried, sometimes humorously, sometimes poetically, to switch off the day and slip into the mysterious velvet of night. So now, as the modern world hums faintly outside, streetlights glowing like anxious fireflies, and your phone ironically reminding you it's time for bed, let yourself soften into stillness. No need to count sheep or worry about Mongol invasions tonight. The horses are fed, the stars content. The past sleeps quietly behind us, and you, dear listener, can do the same. Let go, drift, float backward or forward, into memory, into dream, into the beautiful, boring secret history that lives between one breath and the next. Good night.